I do not know where to come down on this book. It's really, really frustrating. I don't know how to review it. I don't know how anyone could properly review this book because in order to properly talk about how the book affects you and what it does well, you have to kind of talk about the entire thing, and that's spoiler territory. I don't want to spoil it. I sometimes get accused in my comment section of spoiling things, and I never mean to. I give exactly as much information as I deem relevant and important to the themes and the plot and blah blah blah. I need to be able to do my job as a critic. I love my work, I love what I do, and I think I'm really good at it. But I also respect the reader, and I respect the writer and the book, and I need to be able to balance all of that. But in order to talk about this and not be negative about it, I have to just acknowledge certain things that happen in it. But before I do any of that, let's just go back to the beginning. Basic information, let's just start there. This is The Night House, written by iconic, legendary Norwegian author Jo Nesbø. It was translated into English by Neil Smith, and Jo Nesbø is very, very famous across the entire world for writing crime fiction. His Harry Hole series of crime novels is a very, very big deal everywhere. Translated into 50 plus languages, the guy's a big deal. He's also a musician, his books have been turned into films. One of his books was a modern day retelling of Shakespeare's Macbeth, which I haven't read because he had the audacity to turn my beloved Macbeth into a cop. But The Night House is his first proper foray into the horror genre, and I love horror. So I was really, really excited to check this out, and the very, very first, very, very positive thing I have to say about it is this cover is gorgeous. Look at this thing. This is very evocative of 70s, 80s horror stories, horror cinema in particular. This really feels like a camp 80s movie cinema gore fest. I love this cover. And when you turn it over, you've got the house again, but this time there's someone in the window. That's a nice touch. This is a review copy. I don't know if the final copy will have that, but it's awesome. So the cover's amazing. Good start. But beyond that, I don't really know what to say. So the book is separated into 3 acts, 3 parts. And part 1, which you can see if you just sort of flick through it without paying any attention to it, takes up about 2/3 of the novel. It's the main bulk of the text. Part 2 takes up about 5 chapters across like 50 pages or so. And then part 3 is a single chapter that takes up the final 30 pages. I'll just give you that to start with. Part 1 begins with a boy. He is our narrator protagonist, and his name is Richard. He's from a big city, and his parents tragically died, and so now he's had to move out into a tiny little village town place in the middle of nowhere next to an enormous forest where there are 100 trees to every person. This is very rural. I was kind of picturing Twin Peaks, maybe more rural than that. He's moved out there, he's 14 years old, and he's living with his pretty kind aunt and uncle. His uncle is a fire chief, but Richard's not a very nice kid. He's an outcast, he gets bullied, he gets laughed at by the other kids, and so he lashes out, he's kind of cruel. The 1 or 2 friends he manages to gather and draw to him like a magnet, he's not very nice to. He treats them like shit. He's bullied, and he kind of bullies in turn. He's a real punk, outcast, renegade kid. And in the very, very first chapter, he convinces one of his new friends to step into an old-fashioned phone booth with him, pick up the phone book that's on the shelf there, and prank call a random person that they pick. But when they do that, Richard's friend, Tom, who's the one holding the receiver, suddenly gets eaten by the phone, as the cover beautifully illustrates. And it's really gruesome. This is the very first chapter. It's like the first thing you see when you read this book, is that Tom is slowly eaten by this phone. It sucks him up bit by bit as he's screaming and wailing and getting chewed up and slurped up by a phone receiver. And then he's completely gone. And nobody believes Richard when he tries to explain it. He tells his aunt and uncle, he tells the police, and people obviously don't believe him. And because he's a punk renegade kid, people think that maybe he did something to Tom. Tom is now missing. He's gone somewhere. Did Richard hurt him? Did Richard chase him away? What happened? We know what happened, but no one else is going to believe that. This is a very Stephen King-esque story. It feels almost derivative of King at times, because you have a teenage protagonist in a rural town setting that feels like it could be set in Maine, where all of King's stories are set. And it's about a kid who experiences some really terrifying horror, and he also spends time being bullied at school, being mean to other kids. You get to know his life, you get to know how he spends his free time, but there's the terrifying horror that is kind of chasing him and slowly killing other people he knows. Other friends are at risk of something weird happening to them. And it's all related to this one supposedly haunted house, the Night House, which sits at the heart of this enormous forest at the edge of their town. Very, very Stephen King-esque. But it's also kind of uninteresting. You learn more about the house as you go. You learn more about the person who supposedly used to live there, who apparently went insane and ended up in a local asylum. And you kind of start wondering, maybe this guy's ghost is haunting the house and is hurting people for some reason. We have to learn more about his backstory and why he wants to hurt these children and blah, blah, blah. It feels very Stephen King, and it feels fine. It's kind of a YA horror story. That's how it feels. It is not scary at any point. Like, the events that happen are weird and pretty eye-opening, but they're not written in a particularly frightening way. There is a very obvious and awkward lack of tension and creepy atmosphere going on here. It's written almost in a matter-of-fact way. And so as I was reading this, I was thinking, yeah, okay, kind of a fun horror story, kind of Goosebumps, kind of Stephen King. It's fine. But this guy's a legend. Why isn't this book more interesting, more atmospheric, more dynamic? And there is a reason for that. And it's really difficult to talk about why. Without spoiling anything at all, I've told you this book is separated into 3 acts. And all I'll say is that when you get to Act 2, 2/3 of the way through the book, things go insane. And I went from reading this and just turning the pages and thinking this is a very mid-adequate, paint-by-numbers horror story to something genuinely interesting and twisted and exciting. Still kind of predictable, still not really doing anything brand new with the genre, but certainly I'm now invested. 2/3 of the way through this book, I became very excited, very invested, and I was frantically turning the pages to get to the end. That final third is brilliant, but I cannot tell you why, and that is frustrating. I wonder if I had known anything about that going in, if I'd be more interested, but I'm not going to spoil it, obviously. However, I am aware that some people consider the knowledge that there is a twist a spoiler in and of itself, even if you don't tell people what the twist is. Some people don't want to know that there is a twist. The knowledge that there is a twist creates certain expectations in your mind, and I've just done that. So if I've offended or upset or annoyed anyone, I'm really, really sorry. But I feel like just knowing that this is a pretty mid story until it's not is important to get people interested, because I was not looking forward to reviewing this. As I was reading part 1, I was thinking, this is going to be a book I have nothing good to say about. And still, everything I've described happens in part 1. Early on in part 1, and I was not sold on it, and I thought this is going to be a really boring thing to review. It's just a very mid horror story. But it gets so good, and just trust me on that. Just the knowledge that in the final third, this book gets real good, real weird, really twisted and trippy, and very unpredictable. That should drive you to want to read it. Just go in with the expectations that for the first long leg of this book, which thankfully is short, it's about 250 pages, you might find it very derivative, very uninspired, and there is a reason for that. There is a point to it. Just stick with it. I really wish I had been told that. I wish I'd been told that there is a reason why this book seems kind of bland and a very YA horror blah. Just stick with it. I feel like I've made this entire video about spoilers and the nature of them and twists and turns and blah blah blah, and I'm sorry. It's just that this book is so shocking and strange in its execution, but it isn't at all until it is, and the knowledge that it will be could be in and of itself a spoiler, and I'm very conscious of that. The larger my YouTube channel gets, the larger my audience gets, the more I get called out for spoiling certain things, because everyone has their own metric for what a spoiler is. And I'm getting more and more conscious of that, but I can't let that affect the way that I do my criticism, because I love my job, I think I'm good at it, and I need to keep reviewing books in the way that I want to. I'm starting to bring my personal quibbles into this, and I don't mean to. It's just hard when you spend too much time reading a comment section. The Night House is a really, really boring book until it isn't. And that is part of the point, or the entire point, I guess. So where do I come down on it ultimately? Because even though once you finish the book and you put it down, you feel really, really satisfied by a genuinely great twisted horror story, you certainly don't feel that for a long time. And asking readers to trust the writer, to trust the story, to trust his plan, and read a very mid horror story for quite a while, for about 150 pages, it's a lot to ask of a reader. It's a lot to ask of someone who could pick up a different book that grabs them from page one, that immediately enthralls them from the first sentence. This book doesn't really do that. And it really is a lot to ask. And I kind of find Joe Nesbø's courage admirable in that sense, but at the same time kind of frustrating. Because I grew up playing video games. I grew up playing long RPGs. And I remember when Final Fantasy XIII came out, and people kept saying, that game gets good after you've been playing it for 30 hours. And I thought, fuck that. That is not a good game. If you have to play for 30 hours before it gets good, I'm not going to do that. I did, and it didn't even really get good. It never got good. And this happens so often with video games. Oh, it just takes a while. You know, the tutorial is slow. The first few hours are slow, and then it really gets going. Fuck that. That's bad game design. And now I'm faced with that same situation with a novel, which doesn't happen. A novel might be slow to go and slowly build up momentum, but this is a book that is slow on purpose for 2/3 of its time, until it suddenly explodes into something really exciting and interesting and twisted and original and fucking great. Oh my god. It's so weird. It's such a weird thing to talk about. Ultimately, if you're prepared to get through the boring bit, or maybe boring's the wrong word, the mid-acceptable horror schlock bit, the payoff is worth it. And the ending is worth it. And therefore, once you've closed it, the entire experience does feel worth it. So trust me on that. Ultimately, if it's a book you're prepared to buy and read and finish, you will have a good time, and I recommend it wholly. If you don't like the idea of the first 2/3 of this book being mid, and a payoff like that doesn't seem worth it to get through this slog, I'm totally with you. I get it completely. It's a bold move from the author, but ultimately I liked it because it's made me behave like this. So if you like the sound of it, check out The Night House. It's good, I promise. Eventually. Please, dear Havel Secker, can you please put my quote on the back of the paperback? What did I even just say? It's good eventually, I promise. Like, please put that. I don't get quotes on books often enough, but I really want that one. It's good eventually, I promise. Subscribe for books.